The gorge kept its own weather, and I treated it like a temperamental partner. I moved that morning the way our protocols taught me, not to prove anything, only to stay within the narrow place where chance does less damage. The snow had a crust that sounded like paper torn along a careful fold. The surface was bright and without promise. The wind braided spindrift across it so evenly that relief and hazard looked the same until the pole bit and told the truth. I checked the avalanche beacon against my chest and waited for the familiar heartbeat in my palm. It came steady, enough to set my breathing where it needed to be. My ice axe rode in my uphill hand, pick forward, adze away, ready to settle a disagreement between slope and boot. The rescue toboggan slid behind me on its leash like a silent argument I might have to win later. We had a call from a cabin cluster at the mouth of the gorge before dawn. A missing trapper who had not come back when he said he would, last known to be moving along the old sled line above the cut. Dispatch sent the nearest team. I was the point for the first leg. My partner and the rest of the team would follow the flagged route as soon as the machine had a clean path to pull the sleds. I asked them to hold off the machines until I knew the plates of the snow would tolerate the weight. The decision was practical, and it was also selfish. I like the first hour when a landscape still has its own voice and mine is quiet. The radio on my shoulder coughed, cleared, and promised company. I kept it at a polite distance in my mind. I moved with a pattern that keeps fear from taking the microphone. Probe the first few spans, read the finish of the snow grains on the pole tip, scan for the subtle dish of a camouflaged hole, feel through the crampon points whether the layer beneath is old and stubborn or young and indecisive. I measured the span between stakes left by last season's training run and found them inconsistent with the memory I carry of that line. The markers might have been tugged by winter, or my recollection had been sanded by too many days, but the spacing felt off in a way that makes the neck take on a stiff angle. I noted it on my map with a short mark and pushed on. The gorge groaned the way old timbers talk. I paused out of habit, because it is wise to let any big place declare itself before you argue with it. A channel wind rose from below, dry as old paper, and brought a scent that did not match the sky. It smelled like thawed moss and low water, a spring smell in the middle of a season that crushes such smells flat. I pinched the nose of my balaclava and breathed again to be sure. The scent stayed there, thin but ordinary if it had been a different month. I kept it in the column of observations I do not like to force into meaning. The checklist steadied me. Beacon test, axe in hand, belay device clipped where the glove could find it, snow saw strapped to the pack for blocks if I had to cut a platform, toboggan tail secure. Everything was where it was supposed to be. I called a short update to base. The transmission went out clean at first and then frayed, as if the air had teeth. The reply came back in pieces, a voice I know well broken into syllables that refused to live together. I lifted the antenna with 2 fingers and angled it against the slope as we teach, using the face as a reflector, then stepped to a slightly higher lip where line of sight should have improved. The reply returned, serviceable but thinner than the math would predict. I recorded the glitch in my notebook as a simple remark, not a complaint. Radios fail often enough in cold and terrain. Still, there was a hesitance in the signal that did not belong solely to physics. Tracks found me near the first bend where the cliff throws a shadow that refuses to move quickly, even when the sun makes a show of it. The prints had the right boot pattern for the missing man's kit list, but the spacing suggested a stride too, even for a person hauling a small sled in this crust. I am not proud of how long I stood looking at the line. I have learned that a tidy pattern across bad ground can be an artifact of wind and the luck of frozen drift. I have also learned that it can be a sign of a person moving with a plan that does not include returning. The heel edges were sharp where the shelter of a small wind lip had protected them, then softened where the channel took them. I crouched, eased a glove off, and felt the crushed snow with 2 fingers. It was colder than it should have been under the crust and warmer than it should have been at the edges, as if pockets of the air could not agree with each other about the hour. I cut a block with the snow saw to test the layers, and the slab sheared in a way that told me the mountain was moody but not vindictive. The anchor I set bit shallower than my training film's wand, so I reset it and weighted the line until the strap hummed in the glove. We learn early to require our tools to argue back. The second set held with a small complaint, and I let the toboggan down a short apron so it would not play a trick of momentum later. The gorge exhaled again, a gust that should have carried only cold, and instead carried a smell like wet lichen. I put the thought where I keep the ones that could be explained by upstream water I could not see. Routine is a kind of shelter, and I kept rebuilding it every few strides. I checked cornice shape at the rimline above and kept well inboard. I tapped ahead with the axe and listened to the pitch under my boots. The sound returned oddly delayed once, as if the cliff had to think before it cared to answer. I tried again, and the echo behaved the way stone and snow usually behave. I told the place, aloud and soft, that I was not impressed, which is what you say when you are in fact impressed, and you do not want the body to know. The radio broke into my thoughts with a short burst, and then nothing. I asked for a repeat, and received silence as full as a hallway with a door closing at the far end. A moment later the reply arrived, late and complete, my partner telling me the snow machine convoy was holding until I gave them a line they could trust. I acknowledged and picked a path that favored conservative angles over speed. The wind arranged itself into a steady push on my right side and kept it there with the persistence of a person trying to help who does not know how. I leaned against it and felt my pack shift the way a companion shifts when the subject changes. There is a point in a day like this when orders and field reality shake hands and then argue. The plan said I should stay to the left of the old sled line and keep the slope between safe bounds. No bold traverses, no drama. The tracks, however, curled toward the lip of a hollow that would give me a better shot at visual contact with the lower channel. I let the plan and the tracks talk it out while I made a platform with the saw and ate a mouthful of frozen food that did not belong in any story except one about duty. I took a sip from the bottle I keep inverted to keep the lid from freezing, then adjusted the shoulder strap until my arm remembered it was part of me. The smell drifted up again, moss and wet bark, and for a second I was in a different season beside a small creek where I teach new volunteers how to read banks. I came back to the present and chose the conservative line, announcing it to myself so I would remember later that I had not chased an easier view at the price of a harder return. The first small anomaly changed size when I put words to it. The stake spacing still bothered me. I measured by pacing in the old way, heel to toe, and the count my body keeps from long practice did not fit the memory of last year's trail. The map I carried, laminated and scarred, placed a caution mark at a swell that should have been behind me. The swell I could see and feel lay ahead. Either winter had reworked the land more than usual, or my map and the ground had decided to argue about what a curve means. I set another note, short and careful, because it is easy to make a mystery out of snow that merely behaved like snow. I moved toward the lip of a small basin, and the snow darkened under the surface, as if a cloud had entered it from below. That look can happen when thin layers hover over a void. I stepped back as the rule says and cut a probe hole with the saw tip. The hole breathed at me, a change in the whisper around my knees that made the hair under the mask prick. I reset my stance and towed in the crampons hard to convince my feet of my intentions. The radio offered a single syllable in the voice of my partner and then went quiet again. I keyed up and said what we practice. Still moving, testing as I go, deviation from last season's stake memory, signal intermittent, no incident. I heard my own voice in the cup of the gorge come back late and lower, as if someone had recorded it with tired batteries and played it back at a lazy speed. Then bass answered in real time, cheerful and clipped, asking for a status mark on the digital map. I placed it, felt the lag again on my end, and decided that physics had done this sort of disrespect to us before, and it would again. By the time the channel wind built to a firm pressure on my coat, I had made a small bargain with the day. I would stay long enough to prove the slope means no harm to machines, and long enough to learn whether the tracks slide into the bend or out of it. I would not allow curiosity to outvote procedure. I promise myself things like that, and I keep the promise until I don't. I felt the toboggan tug behind me, felt the leash speak to my glove, and told the whole arrangement that we were going to behave like professionals. The gorge agreed in its own language, a drum down deep where water used to be and where, if the scent were telling the truth, water might be moving again under the skin of winter. I looked at the next span of white, took the pole in both hands, and stepped toward the echo. The wind came up the channel and steadied like a hand on my back. Not hard enough to move me, just enough to decide the pace without asking. I kept my world inside the width of my shoulders and the span of the probe pole, and let the gorge set the conversation. The tracks turned to favor the rim, edging a long bowl where the snow went a shade darker beneath the surface. I talked it through aloud the way we teach. Distrust the pretty, prove the suspicious, never hurry for the view. The axe went in, the adze worried the crust, the crampon teeth told me what was brittle and what was waiting. The beacon murmured against my sternum, my anchor strap thrummed faintly on the toboggan ring, and the radio sat silent like a dog that has learned not to bark at gusts. I cut another block and watched the plane give on the glide like a page tearing along a crease. Stable enough for a cautious traverse, not kind to surprises. I set a line for the toboggan and moved across the shallower arc where wind had scoured. The basin below gave off that ill-timed scent again, wet bark and a hint of earth, as if a thaw line were walking under the snow with a mind of its own. It is ordinary to smell water if ice is moving. It is not ordinary to smell it with the air this dry and the light this sharp. I held the breath and released it slowly, putting the observation in the column labeled "Not Yet Useful." A long scratch cut across the path of the boot prints. Something dragged and then released, as though the missing man had lowered a small load and then changed his mind. The scratch ended in a clean stop with no scuffle, a neatness that people rarely make when they are tired and working alone. I crouched, glove off again, and felt the track edge. The crystals at the lip had softened, and then crisped in a way that suggested a short-lived warmth pressed from below. Pockets of air breathed in trickster rhythms here. The echo from my axe taps came back with a small delay that did not match the distance. I tapped twice more and got two answers. One from the cliff, one from somewhere under the skin, both honest, neither friendly. The radio cleared its throat and delivered a late packet in my partner's voice, holding at the pullout, waiting on my go. I answered with the plain facts and offered a caution about the wind and the off-schedule scent. The acknowledgement arrived squeezed at the edges, as if pressed through fabric. I lifted the antenna and angled it to use the slope as a reflector. The next reply was clean enough. We both pretended the gap hadn't happened, which is a skill you need in these places. Machines like to test your patience before they test your life. I moved along the curve, counting by rhythm rather than steps, because rhythm can handle terrain better than arithmetic. Where the line bent, the snow turned glacier, the surface hard and glazed with spindrift, sealed into faint waves. I kept the pick ready for a quick self-belay if the edges lied. The toboggan nudged at my calves like a student eager to show perfect form and mostly succeeding. At the basin's shoulder, I cut another platform and stood still long enough for the landscape to either forgive or refuse me. The wind made a low chord against my coat. Below, where the rim fell away, something gave a single hollow note, not the crack of a true release, more like a barrel shifted on a dock by a lazy swell. There was a flag in my mind where last season's training line should have crossed a safer rise. The ground insisted it lay farther along. I checked the laminated map, dry-wiped clear of frost with the base of a glove, and found our caution mark displaced by the same quiet measure as earlier. I do not enjoy it when paper and land disagree. I was taught to side with land until it proves untrustworthy, and even then to ask what I missed. I navigated by the old belt of stunted spruce on the far wall, by the way the wind braided powder in the same direction for longer than a simple gust would, by the cliff's habit of echoing taps at a particular pitch. I had enough anchors in the reel that I could keep moving without lending too much weight to the sensation that the bowl below drifted a finger's width farther away each time I looked. A soft clatter from my left sent me down on one knee out of practice and respect. It was only a crust plate sliding from a small lip and skating a short distance before catching. But after it stopped, I heard the faint scrape again in a place I could not see, and again a moment later from behind me where there was nothing in motion. The mountain's old noises like to travel, but these sounded near and late, delayed in a way my mind registered before my ears. I spoke into the radio and gave a simple line. Wind increasing, echo behavior inconsistent, continuing along the rim, no visual on the man, tracks still crisp with odd cadence. The reply came back in proper time and told me to keep my head and report any sign that suggested changing the plan. I said I would. It is easy to say. When the bowl tightened into a narrow throat, I had to decide whether to commit to a dicey cross or climb a short rib to the safer side. The cross would save time we did not have, but asked me to trust a thin bridge over darker snow. The climb meant burning energy and returning later with the sled team along a line they might curse but would live with. I chose the rib and gave the bridge a polite nod. The rib demanded points and patience. I planted the axe, moved a foot, waited for the test pull through the leash, moved the other, repeated until the slope admitted me to its shoulder. Halfway up, the beacon gave a hiccup of static where none belonged. I glanced at the field meter out of reflex, I try not to admit. then reminded myself that cold does what it wants to electronics and breathes false hope into people who want to hear a living signal. Still, I held a breath and listened. The hiccup did not return. I logged it anyway, a single line about a transient noise at the rib. At the top, I looked back along the bowl and saw my own traverse unfurl behind me like a measured sentence. The wind laid a skin across part of it, and that was ordinary. Less ordinary was the way one of my axe tap marks simply wasn't there. The bridge below was unmarked, perfect as if no one had stood over it testing, only a soft, dull patch amid gloss. I have erased my own sign before with a poor choice of approach and a little drift. I have not erased clean tap marks without leaving some record of the attempt. I watched a moment longer until the wind pressed glimmer over that patch, then I turned away. There is a difference between superstition and prudence. I don't carry the first, and I owe my life to the second. On the far shoulder, the tracks reappeared with the same obedient spacing. They came out of a scoured pocket where wind should have chewed them to nothing, and yet had not. Between two prints, a short bar of smoothness lay like a tongue, a skier's pole trail without the pole. I set the toboggan, clipped the leash to an anchor, and stepped in to see the edges. The walls of each print had slumped a little inward, then crisped again, a second settling as if someone had lifted a foot, waited, and then set it back without weight just to see. I said the missing man's name under my breath and felt the gorge take it and fail to echo it properly. Names usually come back clear from a cliff. This one returned as air, no consonants, just the pulse of breath. I radioed the team and delivered the boring truth. No visual, tracks present, plan holds, wind increasing, request they continue to wait for my corridor marking before moving machines. My partner did not answer at once. I heard instead the base dispatcher repeating the same acknowledgement she had given earlier, syllables in the same order, as if a recording had been set to polite. After a beat, my partner came through properly, with fresh words and a small joke about the cold finding a way into the wires. I laughed because laughing is a tool, then told them again to wait. I cut 2 snow blocks and built a stout low wall to mark the line I wanted, leaving a gap where the bowl throat would tempt a hurried driver to cheat. The wall was work a machine could read even in poor light. I moved on with the smell of thaw ghosting the edge of the mask now and then, the wind steady at my side, the map and the land in a quiet argument that neither seemed eager to win. The gorge's low drum deepened, a sound you feel in the straps more than hear. I let my pace match it because rhythm is medicine in white places. Ahead, the rim tightened again, and I saw where I'd have to trust a shallow anchor to lower the toboggan into a slot that did not like me. I told myself that the day was still on my terms and knew that the day had heard me. I tested the first pick placement, and the strap hummed a warning I chose not to ignore. Then I shifted a half step toward the echo and began to build the safest wrong option I could live with. The slot took the light and swallowed it whole, a seam pulled through white cloth. I built the anchor the way we teach for shallow snow that does not deserve trust, burying the axe as a deadman and packing blocks with the saw until the line sang in my gloves. The belay device felt like an obedient animal against the rope, warm from friction, steady as long as I was calm. The toboggan went first with a cautious payout, nose tipped just enough to keep it from slewing, and then I edged in after it, hips square to the fall line, testing each platform with a heel before I dared weight it. The wind held to my right shoulder, a constant nudge like a friend who thinks they know your pace better than you do. Every few breaths, the scent of wet bark returned, out of calendar, and I could taste it even through the mask, as if my tongue kept souvenirs. Halfway down the slot, the radio coughed, gave me my name in my partner's voice, and then simply let go. The silence was not clean. It had grit in it, small bits of previous sentences floating there. I held my position, set the toboggan on a leash to the line, and keyed up with the update we always use when we need the other half of our courage. On rope, descending a narrow, anchor solid, wind steady, no visual on subject. The machine stayed quiet. I let the wind speak for it, and counted 3 breaths with my eyes on the crosshatch of scratches that winter writes on glaze. I tried again. The reply returned slow and wrong, the exact words from my earlier status about the basin, same tone, same cadence, as though the gorge had kept them and was feeling generous. I asked for a fresh repeat, and this time got my partner, quick and living, telling me that their screen showed my token moving along the rim and asking if I meant to drop in now. I said yes, and because I am not reckless, I added that the slot was misbehaving in small ways. They told me to keep the channel open. I told them I would. And then the channel did the thing it sometimes does in cold valleys and fell off a ledge again. A small tremor traveled through the strap in my hand. Not the bounce of a sled settling, but a low stroke, a pulse, as if something under the snow were shifting in slow motion. The echo of my breath had a second voice I did not care to name. I eased lower to a ledge where the slot doglegged and took stock. The tracks I'd been following crossed above me and then vanished at the lip of a shallow roll where the wind should have erased them. Instead, a few remained, crisp and immodest, with that same careful spacing that never looks like a tired human. Between two prints, the surface showed a faint, smooth ribbon, as though a length of cord had passed and lifted cleanly. I touched the ribbon with 2 fingers and felt the kind of warmth that is not heat, more like the memory of it. When I lifted my hand, my glove smelled of spruce needles that should have been sleeping. I told the sight and the smell that I would not make a story out of them and moved on. At the bottom of the slot, the floor opened to a bench just wide enough for decision-making. I pulled the toboggan beside me and reset the anchor in denser snow, cutting a new block and stamping it until the squeak underfoot told me the crystals had agreed to hold hands. The wind turned a note lower, and the gorge answered with a distant drum that seemed to move against the grain of the valley, not down it. I preferred the honesty of cold metal. I touched each carabiner, glanced at the belay device, checked the beacon with a palm press, and heard the small pulse that tells you that some part of the world is working, even if you're not. I called again. This time base answered first, brisk and steady, reading from protocol. Confirm your position, report stability, any sign of the subject. I gave them what I had and added a caution about the map and ground arguing. While I spoke, another voice lifted under the official one, my partner again, but late, offering the same small joke about the cold in the wires. It should have been funny. It was only familiar. I asked them both to repeat. Base did, clean. My partner did not. Something, somewhere, played that earlier joke again, as if it were proud of knowing how to loop. I watched the tiny flutter in the radio's signal light that sometimes shows wind-induced chatter, and told myself that the channel was bouncing off the walls and bringing ghosts. Nothing supernatural about it, only uncooperative angles and air. The bench led to a collar of drift that wanted to usher me out onto a glazed shoulder. The shoulder overlooked the lower channel and might give me a line on the sled route I wanted. It also carried that darker under snow that made the axe tap come back a shade late. I worked to the edge, tapping, listening for shell and spine, willing the land to declare a preference. On the far side of the glazed patch, a clump of brush held up a little island of powder, and there, punched into it at a careful angle, a single boot mark pointed toward the drop. The heel had been tested twice, set and reset in the same hollow. The toe showed a twist that people make when they glance over a shoulder without wanting to. I stepped wide around it and kept my own eyes forward. The toboggan tugged again and the leash thrummed in my hand like a string plucked by someone with poor rhythm. I thought of the missing man in a place like this, tired, listening, making the small bargains you make when the land insists on an exchange. I thought of orders and the ways we bend them when the ground has a better idea. The plan said I should mark a corridor and bring the machines through once I had truth underfoot. The day said the lower channel might be holding a soft place that needed a human first and a machine never. I told the radio I was taking a slow arc along the shoulder to test the bridge and that no one would advance until I had returned to the bench and reported. Base said, copy. My partner said, copy. Then the radio stripped its words and left me with air. I crossed the glazed patch with small steps and a low center, pick ready, glove on the strap in case the sled thought it had better places to be. The ice had a tone like a bell 2 rooms away. Beneath it, a quieter tone lagged just enough to teach caution. Midway across, the wind backed down to a whisper, and with it the smell of thaw rose again, richer now, as if something had opened a door. For a heartbeat, the echo of my last axe tap did not come back. I did not like that. I planted both feet, drove the pick, and waited until the belay sang and the echo returned from the cliff with a late, tired answer. Then I moved on with the kind of patience that looks like indecision to anyone who has never broken through. At the rim, the land let me look. The lower channel was a long tone of white with seams where old flows had frozen and been buried. The whole thing shaped like a tongue, its tip lost in shadow. Near the center, a line of dimples trailed off and faded. Not boot, not paw, a regularity like the track of a sled runner, pressed lightly and then skimmed. On the far wall, the stunted trees leaned as if a breeze lived below the surface. I said the missing man's name again, under my breath, and got the same refusal of echo, just breath returning, no consonants to carry it. The beacon at my chest gave a hopeful trill, and then a flat nothing, the sound of a battery that wants you to believe. I touched the casing and felt warmth that should not have been there, as if the unit had found a pocket of air that remembered a different season. I marked the safe arc with short walls, so a driver would not mistake my footsteps for welcome, then climbed back to the bench to keep my promise to report from secure ground. Before I could key the mic, the radio made a dry, tearing noise and spoke in my partner's voice right behind my ear, close as a whisper, saying, "Hold for the corridor, we'll ride your lines," like they were standing at my shoulder. The hairs inside the mask disagreed with that detail. I turned by inches, as if I could sneak up on my own nerves, and saw only the wall I had built, clean and square in the wind. I spoke into the mic and said, "Say again from the pullout," and the answer came back from miles away in the honest rush of a machine idling, my partner repeating the same words but with boredom in them. A living boredom you get when you've been waiting too long at a roadside. The first version had none of that weariness. It had only precision, as if someone had studied the sentence and decided to deliver it perfectly. I told Base I would finish the corridor and return to the rim to receive the sleds when they arrived, that I would not commit machines into the lower channel until I had a better sense of the bridge, that I would consider a foot search beyond the slot only if I had a second human on rope. The truth was simpler. I did not want to go where the scent came from while the radio was playing at echoes. The map at my knee still refused to line up with the swell ahead. The wind held its steady hand. Somewhere under the snow, something shifted again in that long, patient way that is not a collapse and not quite an animal. I reset the leash on the toboggan, tightened the gate on the belay device, and told the gorge that I was going to finish this line, and then I would listen harder. The gorge answered with the same drum I had been matching all morning, and the radio, polite as a host, cleared its throat and went silent a second time. The corridor I built felt orderly enough to persuade a machine, and honest enough to keep a driver alive, but the shoulder ahead asked for a test I could not delegate. I dragged the toboggan to a stance with good manners and set an anchor where the snow stiffened over a shallow spine. The axe went in on a low angle, backfilled with blocks I cut quick and flat. The line threaded through the belay device until it lay straight and humming. When I weighted it, the bite held, but only by posture, not conviction. The strap thrummed in a loose register that tells you the snow tolerates you without approving. I stayed roped because pride has no place on glazed ground. The wind kept its hand to my right, steady as an escort that refuses a conversation. From the rim, the lower channel looked quiet in that way streams do when they freeze in layers and keep moving somewhere under the white. A cat's paw of dimples ran away toward shadow, regular and light, each one too neat for the messy truth of a burdened person. I marked a no-go with a short wall, opened a narrow doorway where I wanted the sled, then stepped off to test a shallow bridge that crossed the channel's faint seam. The bridge returned the wrong echo when I tapped it, a small, late answer, as if the snow had to think about whether to be snow. I took a single breath, set the pick, and pressed just enough weight to hear the story a little deeper. The surface grumbled below the pitch of wind. I took the hint and backed away, grateful for ordinary caution. The radio offered a plain, useful sentence from base that sounded like a hand on the shoulder. "We see your corridor marks. We will hold machines until you return to the ridge. Report if you require a second rope." I said what the book says and what I meant. I would prefer another set of hands before I committed to the lower traverse. Signal remains inconsistent. Evidence of movement not matching a human pace. Map and ground still arguing in small ways. While I spoke, my partner's voice rose behind the base dispatchers, late again, unspooling the same reassurance about waiting at the pullout and checking carb heat and nothing new. I heard their breath in it, the small impatience of an idling engine, and then the gorge played the same reassurance again, word perfect, without the breath. I swallowed the suspicion and answered the living voice. Pretending you have not heard a ghost is a field skill. I kept to the safer wall and walked the corridor, adding short blocks where wind would hollow a warning into the trail and closing gaps where a tired driver might read permission into the empty. The scent of thaw came and went with no respect for direction and brought a brief memory of spruce tips under spring rain, a memory that belonged to another job and a brighter season. I kept my gloves working, told myself the smell was a low vent somewhere under layered ice, and checked the beacon against my chest. It returned a healthy rhythm. The casing felt warmer than the air by a hair. I accepted that Some pockets remember a different day and let it live there without a story. At the next corner, the ground sloped away in a featureless fall toward the channel's gut. The safe choice ran high and mean along a ridge of sastrugi that would hate a wide load. The efficient choice crossed a pale apron that looked smooth as truth. Smooth is a liar. I drove a picket-length trench with the axe, fed the line, and leaned back until the anchor spoke. It answered with a shallow bite and then a slow give. Not a failure, just a sigh. I reset with a deeper bury and more blocks, packed with knees and forearms, until the squeak under pressure changed to a firm rasp. When I leaned this time, the hum settled into a deeper note. It still felt like a promise from someone who owes you another favor. I told the toboggan we were going in short and careful, and began the traverse with the kind of attention that makes the world narrow into boot edges and breath timing. Midway across the apron, the wind flattened to a quiet murmur, and the silence acquired texture, small dry sounds that traveled without a source. The echo of my last tap came back late, and, for a breath, pitched low, as if the cliff were tired. I planted both feet, set the pick, and waited for the echo to convalesce into something I recognized. It arrived a moment later as a proper clap. I took another step, and the toboggan nudged, no malice in it, just momentum unhappy at being restrained. The strap in my hand vibrated with an offbeat, a distant thump that did not belong to me or to sled. The apron pulsed under the skin, not a collapse, not even a settling. Only a long, patient flex, as if something beneath shifted politely to accommodate us. The boot prints reappeared at the far lip, as if they had chosen to ignore the geology I had just negotiated. They landed with the same patient spacing and the same occasional tongue of smoothness laid between two steps. I measured without counting, by the metronome of breath and the old feel of stride length across snow types, and decided again that a tired man with a load does not walk like that. I crouched and laid a gloved palm by a stray print that had caught a pinch of blowing powder. The powder blinked and skittered away, not from wind, but as though the small air near the snow surface had inhaled and exhaled. I lifted my hand into stillness and felt the faintest draft where no draft should travel. Pockets, I told myself. Vents under layered ice at an edge. The words were not wrong, only insufficient. I radioed the team and gave the route I wanted for the machines, the speed that would keep a tread from skittering, the exact places where backs would want to lean and must not. My partner answered from far away with a clatter of cups against a metal dash, the honest noise of waiting. Then the radio offered the same sentence again without the cups, closer than my own breath, every consonant too polite. I said their name the way you call a friend, gently, in a crowded room. The gorge returned my voice as air again. Breath only, no bones to carry shape. The radio, generous, produced their name back to me in my own mouth, wrong and perfect. I thumbed the push-to-talk and said, "I read you from the pullout, hold for my return to the ridge," and the living voice confirmed with a small swear I forgave because it was weary and real. I did not mention the other reply. I did not call uncooperative acoustics anything else. The map at my knee wanted the caution mark placed behind me. The land insisted I had not passed it yet. I tried a triangulation by habit, taking bearings off the stunted spruce belt and a scab of rock at the far wall, and the way spindrift fell in bands when the wind leaned into the throat. The bearings yielded an answer that drifted a finger's width with each glance, a slow slide, as if the gorge wanted me to admit that fixed points are a luxury. I set a new mark anyway, a little smear on plastic with the soft pencil I keep inside the map case so it won't crack. I told myself I would sort the discrepancy later, with a warmer head and a ruler. For now, the world I could step on was enough. I needed one more anchor to bring the toboggan down a short curl where the apron fell to a shelf. The snow there was the wrong kind of dense, layers crushed into a hardness that rejects hardware and then gives without ceremony. I set the axe again and packed blocks, settled the line, leaned, and felt the bite go shallow under my weight. It held, but it did not like me. I do not enjoy being tolerated by physics. I added a backup, a body belay with the rope around my hips, and the device clip for a catch if the first plan offered an insult. The toboggan moved as asked, with a stiffness that said it had opinions. Halfway down the curl, the strap shivered, the polite pulse again, and the sled's nose dipped as if a small hand had pressed it. I checked everything that could be checked. Nothing moved but what I moved. At the shelf I stopped to listen because listening steals less time than mistakes. The wind downshifted to a murmur that felt like sleep. Below, hidden water or slow air, or a thought I refused to chase, moved under the white with the rhythm of something alive and busy out of sight. I called base, voice low as if volume could offend the place, and gave them the status. Anchor shallow but holding, apron crossed, corridor marked, machine route defined, recommendation to keep weight off the lower channel until rope teams verify. The answer came from far and sounded like people. Received, copy, we appreciate the caution, we'll be at the ridge when you return. Then, near as a whisper inside my hood, the same sentence arrived again in the same words, without the human clutter that makes a message ordinary. I felt the hair at the nape tug, where the balaclava tucked. I chose to treat it as a radio bounce that had found a new angle. The plan said return to the ridge, gather the team, brief the hazards, lead the machines with a corridor of blocks like lanterns in a storm. The land said finish the line while the light holds, because a banked trail rides better than a guess, and the channel does not owe us patience. I set one more wall where a hurried driver would try to cut and saved space for the inevitable bad idea. The smell of wet bark rose a last time and faded, leaving the clean sting of cold metal and wool. I told the gorge I was heading up, and the gorge answered with a drumbeat out of step with my heart. The anchor creaked once like a door not meant to close. I gathered the rope, shouldered the leash, and began the climb back toward the rim where living voices would sound like voices again. The first span went well. On the second, the axe bit shallow in a patch that should have welcomed steel, and the line sang a warning I could not ignore. I reset my stance, chose a safer wrong move over a quicker right one, and felt the mountain consider whether to keep me. The decision took long enough for breath to become a plan. I eased my weight onto the new stance and let the mountain finish thinking about me. When it approved, grudgingly, I set the axe again with a lower angle and packed another block over the head with the saw. Knuckles steady, breath short. The shallow bite told the truth about the snow here, dense enough to pretend, capricious underneath. I buried the shaft as a deadman and listened through my gloves until the hum settled into a tone I trusted for the length of a careful crossing. No longer. The toboggan waited at my hip, leash snug over the belay device, its nose dusted with grains that looked like ash. I brushed the gray away and felt a faint warmth in the sled's plastic, as if it had been near a campfire that did not exist. I named it friction from the earlier descent and kept my mind on steel and rope. The climb to the rim demanded a sequence I know by heart. Plant, test, shift, breathe, repeat until the world narrows to edges. The wind, loyal to my right shoulder all morning, dipped and then returned with a harsher texture, a rasp like wool pulled over a rough board. It carried a smell for a moment that did not belong to the hour or the latitude. Wet needles, creek stones rinsed and left to steam in weak sun. Then it blew clean again as if embarrassed. I told myself a pocket had opened below and exhaled into the slot, a small, ordinary vent that had waited for my weight to confess. The radio cracked and offered the end of a sentence in my partner's voice, just the last friendly word and the small laugh that follows. I answered out of reflex, gave my position and intention, and received base instead, calm and clipped, asking me to repeat because they had not heard a thing. I repeated for the record and logged the stray fragment with a line in the notebook that looked steadier than my pulse. At a shoulder where the snow turned to polished drifts, the boot line reappeared, patient and tidy in a way that work does not allow. The spacing still argued with fatigue. Between two prints, a short, smooth bar lay like a cuff pressed and lifted, clean as a signature. I set the toboggan and knelt to see the edges. The walls of each mark had slumped a little, and then set again as if warmed briefly from below, and asked to try once more. I felt for a draft the way I do on spring rescues when meltwater runs under a bridge and returns a small breath. The air along the surface moved inward and outward in a rhythm not the same as wind. Vents, I told myself again, old channels sighing through layered ice. The words behaved like a rule, and for a short time that was enough. The map and the ground continued their low argument. A caution symbol belonged behind me on paper and insisted on wading ahead in real snow. I set a new pencil scar on the laminate and squared it with a belt of black spruce on the opposite wall and a knob of stone that held light well past midwinter noon. Triangulation yielded an answer that slid when I blinked. I let the sliding be what it was, a trick of parallax and patience, and chose to believe the spruce and the stone over my memory of last season's stakes. I walked my corridor again, tightening gaps with short walls a machine could read without thinking, and left narrow doors where the line must pass. Every block cost a small breath I wanted for the climb, but the cost had to be paid now or paid dearer later, with tracks cut wrong by tired hands. When I reached the shelf where the anchor had sighed at me, I replanted it for the ascent. The first set held just long enough to tell me it would not hold longer than the next decision. The second bit, shallow again, complaining through the strap like a drawer that sticks on one side. I added a backup because I wanted to live, wrapped the rope around my hips, and clipped the belay device for a soft catch if the snow offered me a lesson. The beacon at my chest ticked along and then stumbled into a hopeful trill that did not belong to any real return. I looked at the casing and willed it to tell the truth, then pressed the self-test and received the ordinary pulse I knew. The trilled note felt like a memory lodged in the wires. I marked it as interference and refused the other word waiting at the edge of my thinking. The wind backed itself into the slot and came at me from below for a few breaths, not a gust, more a rising exhale. The echo of an axe tap that should have been quick slid low and arrived late. I tapped again and the answer returned on time, sharp as sheet metal. Below the crust, deep under layered years, a drum rolled with a rhythm I had not earned the right to understand. I made my peace with the idea that water or air or both move under these valleys even in hard months, and that movement does not always consent to be measured. I do not mistake humility for superstition. I treat both as safety if they keep my feet cautious. At the next rise, my crampon point slid on a patch of hardly visible glaze, and I sat unceremoniously into the harness, weight caught by the device, anchor complaining but holding. The tug passed into my hips as a dull ache, the kind you feel long after a day forgets your name. I reset the foot, set the pick deeper, and paid out a little slack for the toboggan, so it would not nose me into a bad angle. That small slip cost me something I had been protecting all morning, the casual trust I like to keep in my hands. I felt the small shake in the knuckles as I planted again and laughed once under the mask because naming it makes it smaller. The radio chose that moment to behave like a polite guest and offered my partner's voice in full, asking for a sit rep and whether I wanted them to start the machines toward the ridge. I told them to hold, that the corridor was marked, that one bridge was honest but thin, that I wanted a second set of hands before I let weight across the lower seam. The reply came back with the clink of a thermos against a dashboard and a tired, good-natured promise to wait. A heartbeat later, the exact reply arrived again without the clink and without the fatigue. I let it pass me, like a story told twice by different people who want different things from your attention. I reached the rim under a light that had grown flat and undecided. A pale veil stood down valley where the channel widens and invites weather to rehearsal. The spruce belt on the far wall rocked without shedding snow, a sign that wind there was all opinion and no teeth. I hauled the toboggan onto level ground and took a long, careful breath while my pulse argued with pace. The beacon sat quiet against my sternum. The belay device hung docile at my hip. The saw's teeth carried a dusting of crystals like filings. I checked the radio's battery by feel and warmth again, a habit born of cold stations where indicators lie to make you feel brave. Everything reported normal in the ways that can be measured by touch and patience. I spoke to base and delivered the orderly version of the morning. Corridor in, bridges tested, apron crossed with caution, one anchor shallow, one holding, route marked for machines, recommendation to hold until I brief the team in person at the ridge. The dispatcher thanked me in that steady cadence that means the office trusts the field. My partner came through a moment later with a joke about the coffee tasting like rope wash and the sky not making up its mind, and the sound of their glove against the steering wheel made me want the company of another human more than I like to admit. I told them I was on my way, that I'd flagged the last blind corner, and that we would walk the line together before the engines moved, because nothing else deserves trust in a gorge that keeps its own weather. As I turned to close the last gap in my wall, a low pressure pressed against my left temple, a small thumb of air, as if the gorge had placed a mark on me to count. The smell of thaw returned, stronger than before, and then ran away as the wind changed its mind and came down channel with intent. The world pulled a curtain of white between me and the far rim, not a full whiteout yet, only a rehearsal, a reminder that flat light is a prelude and not a decision. The anchor at the slot creaked once and then settled. I told the mountain aloud that I had heard it and that I would not pretend so much competence that I missed a second warning. The gorge did not answer with anything more than the same slow drum down where old water remembers the path. I shouldered the toboggan's leash and started for the ridge where living voices wait, where hands on shoulders belong to people and not to weather. The plan remained plain. Bring the team up, ride the corridor as marked, keep weight off the lower seam until we could prove it. Keep the machines honest by making the path idiot-proof. Do the work when it was still our choice to do it. Behind me, the slot held its breath, then exhaled with the long patience of something that does not care how quickly I move. The radio warmed my ear with a whisper in my partner's exact voice saying my name the way old friends say it. When I answered, the valley gave me back only the sound of my own breath, stripped of consonants, a human animal making steam in cold air. I put my head down and walked toward the ridge with the kind of determination that costs a quiet debt I would settle later. After the machines, after the briefing, after we decided what truth the lower channel would allow us to hear. The ridge had a way of hiding in plain sight, a pale rise you could almost mistake for sky until the wind shoved sense back into you. I hauled the toboggan along the corridor I'd carved and let the rhythm of work keep my mind inside the width of the line. The veil-down valley thickened, a patient cloth being drawn across a stage, and the light slipped from flat to pearly to something that erases edges. I spoke into the mic and told Base I was returning to the rendezvous to brief before we committed machines. The acknowledgement came clean first and then returned again a breath later, word perfect and bloodless, as if repeated by a careful mouth that did not need to breathe. I let the living voice be the one I answered and saved the rest for the drawer labeled later. Snow began to move sideways with purpose. The channel wind that had played coach all morning found its confidence and filled the gorge with a steady push that lifted grit and spun it into ghost ropes. The world narrowed to the blocks I had set and the faint walls of sastrugi they leaned against, little ribs that kept a driver honest when the day wants you to drift. My goggles filmed over with a delicate glaze that wiped clean and returned immediately, a polite way of saying the veil had intentions. I took smaller steps, set the axe more often than pride would like, and worked my breath into a marching count that the mountain could not steal. Halfway to the ridge, the radio chirped with my partner's voice, asking if I wanted the machines brought forward to meet me on the safer ground. I looked at the apron I had crossed, and at the darker seam below, and said no. We would gather at the top, walk the corridor together, and I would ride the first sled like a guilty conscience. They laughed, the kind that belongs to people with cold fingers and warm engines, and promised to wait. A moment later, the device produced the same laugh without the scrape of glove-on plastic, and my name without the little dip their voice makes when they are worried. The second version sat too close to my ear. I said nothing to it and put another block on a corner where the wind was trying to eat the path. The scent returned in spite of the cold's attempt to sterilize the day. Wet needles, creek stones, the breath of something thawed and shy. It rose out of the slot behind me and rode low along the surface, an undercurrent that did not match the air in my lungs. I promised the smell a practical explanation later and forced my attention onto how the snow sounded under points and how the leash hummed when the toboggan resisted. A shallow creak came from the deadman I had planted earlier, a single complaint that said the slot did not like any plan that assumed permanence. The anchor settled after its remark, and I repeated mine, heard, noted, not ignored. When I topped the last swell before the ridge, the first sled's nose appeared as a dark wedge in the white, engine idling down to a patient rumble. My partners stood beside it, with their hoods cinched tight and goggles fogged at the edges. That particular posture of people trying to look like they are not waiting as hard as they are. We touched gloves and let the brief pressure say things the radio had failed to say in order. They asked whether the line would hold a convoy or whether we would want to shuttle. I told them the corridor would behave if weight moved like adults and no one tried to rescue time. The apron would tolerate one machine at a time, with a gentle throttle and no sudden changes. The lower seam wanted rope work before anything heavier than a person's doubt touched it. They nodded, and I saw in the tilt of their head that they were already counting which of us would walk where. The white thickened another turn until the far wall vanished, and the near wall lost its personality. The spruce belt that had been my truth went to smudges. We parked the sled and stood in the lee of its bulk, while I pointed with words at a map that no longer matched the visible world. My partner listened the way good partners do, finishing my sentences only where protocol allows predictability. Base crackled in to ask for a go or hold. I said hold while we marked the first span with more body than block. Then advance in single file, my sled first, my partner walking the leash until we cleared the shoulder, the rest staged below the ridge in a cue that no one would try to improve. The dispatcher said copy in the even tone of someone who knows that promises are easier to make at a desk. The same copy drifted in again, precise and close, absent the faint background noise of an office where pencils still exist. I ignored the echo and told my partner we would move now, before the veil decided to become a wall. We advanced with the discipline of people who fear the right things. I walked ahead of the first machine, one hand on the toboggan's leash, the other on the axe. My partner a step to the side to read what I could not with my own feet. I spoke in short sentences that told the driver exactly where to place weight, told them what the sled would try at each lip, told them what not to correct, because the correction would be worse than the sin. The engine obeyed in that slightly too eager way engines have when they feel useful. We reached the first narrow door, and the sled's bulk seemed suddenly theatrical, all angles and wrong intent against a line designed for modesty. The driver breathed out an apology they did not need to make, and threaded the nose through the gap. The wind pressed the same steady palm against my shoulder, and then dropped it without warning. In the hollowed quiet, I heard a low drum under the snow, a rhythm that wanted to set my steps and was not mine to follow. I counted my own cadence aloud and gave the driver a new instruction, just to fill the space where that drum could sit. At the apron we halted to let the white make its next decision. The driver killed the engine, and the sudden absence of its reassurance let the day's smaller noises step forward. Grain skittering along glaze, fabric hissing against fabric, a tiny click from the belay device, a faint rush in the slot like breath from a door opened into a dark room. I tapped the surface with the pick and waited for the cliff to answer. The reply arrived slightly late and lower, then corrected itself, as if the wall had remembered how to be a wall. I declared the crossing open and we moved, sled first, my partner keeping the leash low and supple, the driver holding a throttle that would not insult the bridge. Midway the wind returned and pressed hard, a clumsy hand now, uncoordinated and loud. We leaned into it, and the toboggan yawed with a stubbornness that made my shoulders burn. For a heartbeat the strap thrummed with the wrong note, the one that means a load has been touched by something you cannot see. Then we were across with nothing to show for it but a little noise in the blood. On the far lip the world closed another notch. The next sled waited back at the ridge, a dark patience in the storm. Base asked for a time estimate in that way. Headquarters must ask to keep the world from spreading like spilled grain. I offered a window I did not trust and added a warning about the veil threatening to become a true white. The dispatcher thanked me twice in a row, nearly the same sentence, the second without the tiny chair scrape that had colored the first. My partner glanced over as if they had heard it too and then looked away, which is the field way of saying later. We moved along the corridor to the slot where the anchor had voiced its reservations. The creak came again, not a failure, just a reminder. I replanted the deadman deeper and packed over it until the snow squeaked that warranted consent. The driver trimmed the sled a hair to the upslope side and kept their nose where my words put it. We staged at the bench above the lower seam. The air there had the peculiar stillness of weather preparing to remove choice. The scent of thaw swelled briefly and then was gone, as if swallowed by cotton. My beacon muttered in a rhythm that was not completely its own. I pressed the self-test and it settled, obedient to touch but not to mood. We spoke the plan again. No machines beyond this point until rope work. I would downclimb the first span with the toboggan on belay, my partner on the device. The driver would wait as if waiting were their skill. The driver said they could wait longer than pride liked, and I believed them. I went over the lip, and the white closed around me like breath on glass. The world became a bubble, my body inflated with heat and sound. My partner's commands were the only proof of company. Down a palm, hold, good bite, step on your right, steady. I reached the bench and built another low wall, more habit than shelter, and called up that the seam vented warmer air than it should. The reply from above came as living words, and then as the same words again without breathing between them. I said the mountain was bouncing us silly. My partner agreed too quickly, which told me they had felt the same pressure at their neck and decided to let it be physics. The white rose once more and tried to close the door. The corridor I had built was there because I said it was. The spruce belt was an idea I had to keep believing. The drum under the snow matched my pulse and then did not. I took the line, lifted the toboggan's nose, and said that when the next sled arrived, we would refuse the lower channel until the day learned some manners. My partner laughed in the tired way that answered both the joke and the truth behind it. The radio, eager to be helpful, took my sentence and returned it to me in my own voice, polished and calm. without the rasp the wind had earned. I looked up into a sky that could not be seen and felt the cost ahead like a bruise that has not decided where to flower. Then I set the pick, found my breath, and told the gorge we were staying long enough to finish what we had started. The gorge replied with a drum that did not go with any human rhythm, and the white moved closer as if it had been invited. The white took the angles from the world and left us with gradients that lied. I stood on the bench above the lower seam and built meaning out of small, honest things. The roughness of the axe handle against a bare patch on my glove where the leather had thinned, the grain of snow that hissed when compressed just right, the leash drawing a steady diagonal from my hip to the toboggan's ring. My partner sat the belay device on the edge of the slot and worked it like a stove valve, smooth and decisive, saying little because words use breath and breath fogs sight. The driver waited behind the low wall, visor up to keep it from icing, nodding in that tight way people do when they have nothing to add that won't make things worse. Under the white, the drum came and went with the patience of old weather. Above it, the wind practiced longer sentences. I started the down climb with the toboggan, and the bridge accepted us the way a host does who has heard the gossip and decided you can stay anyway. My boots found edges where training says they should be, then slid half a boot's worth farther than they ought, and I corrected by feel, letting the rope carry what pride would rather do alone. The scent returned for a blink, wet bark and stone warmed by weak sun, and disappeared as if swallowed. I kept my mind inside the size of my hands. Halfway down, the echo of my tap came late, and then returned again even later. The same sound with its knees scuffed, like a replay that did not know where to end. I tapped once more and got a proper clap from the far wall, and a second hint from below, a low answer too patient to be rock. On the bench where the seam's lip made a quiet invitation, I built another short wall to force a sensible approach and then tested the apron with small taps, mapping where the snow stiffened and where it only pretended. The line I drew with taps did not match the doorway my eyes believed they saw. The white likes to make a liar of sight, so I chose the taps. I keyed the mic and gave base the plain shape of our work. Rope on, white tightening, seam warmer than expected, no sign of the subject, corridor holds under discipline, requesting patience. The dispatcher answered with a steadiness I respect, and then, near to my ear inside the hood, the same message arrived again without the background rustle of chairs and paper, each syllable set down like a tool returned to its place. My partner glanced at me and then down to the device without comment. We are paid to notice, not to indulge. We set to ferrying small gear across the safe arc so the ridge team could move faster when the light forced hands. I sent the toboggan over first, with just enough weight to make it listen. The strap thrummed a polite warning where the surface went glassy, and my partner gave it a low correction with the device, voice level in that way that keeps the heart obedient. The sled's nose yawed once like a horse pretending it might shy and then settled. The echo from the far wall slid down a note and then climbed back like a singer who had second thoughts about a key. I put it in the ledger as weather talking through stone and not yet about me. We worked until time became a rope length and a count of breaths. The driver ferried loads between our low walls with humility and a throttle touch that would have made an instructor proud. The veil pressed harder until near and far shook hands and lost their names. When the machine returned to the ridge for one more small load, the radio delivered my partner's voice from behind me, too close, saying gently that we should call it, that the day had chosen. The same voice came back a moment later from up valley with fatigue and wind in it, asking if we needed extra rope. I told the near voice nothing, and answered the living one, asked for another device and fresh cord, and told base we were restructuring to protect the line overnight if the white insisted. Dispatch thanked me with two identical sentences that differed only in the fine grain where breath lives. I have built whole missions on less proof than the difference between those sentences. The seam offered a small compromise in exchange for attention. A thin rind over a darker layer gave under the saw with a whisper that sounded like fabric torn from a nail. I cut a series of tiny niches to persuade the line where to step and where not to. The smell rose once more and lingered long enough for a memory to form out of it. A training creek high in the range, mid-spring, spruce tips bitter and hopeful, the wet wool stink of a cap left too close to steam. The memory did not belong to this month or this hour. I removed it with a breath as if I were clearing a lens and went back to work. We lost a stake to the white, which is how the white keeps score. The thin wand simply wasn't there when I reached for the little flag in my mind. The corridor I had built remained underfoot where the blocks were, but between two sections the path drifted like a story told by a tired witness. I named landmarks out loud that I could not see. The shallow sastrugi ribs along the upslope edge, the slight tilt where the world wants to pull your knee, the notch where wind plays a different note. The driver returned with cord and a fresh device and listened to the naming as if I were describing a house they would have to enter without knocking. A creak came from the deadman above us and, layered under it, a thinner sound, almost a plink, as though a harp string had been plucked under a snow. We all felt the pause that followed, the unhelpful way silence seems to take measurement of you. The anchor settled again with a grudging acceptance. I stepped to the seam to test the warm breath that kept teasing the mask, and found it stronger at one spot that had no reason to be a vent. My glove felt it change direction twice, as if the seam were a chest under a blanket. I said aloud, "Air, channels under layers, nothing new, nothing strange." My partner said, "Copy, nothing new, nothing strange." The radio repeated, "Copy, nothing new, nothing strange," in my partner's tone, and did not trouble itself to pretend at distance. When the second rope was set, we made the choice that costs and pays. Establish a secure point on the far side, so that when the ridge team moved, we would not be building anchors in a storm with engines idling and nerves making bad arithmetic. I volunteered to run the span on foot, because I was already wearing the day's mistakes, and because it is poor practice to ask a colleague to do the part you have rehearsed only in your head. My partner's reluctance was practical and human. We spoke the risks in short language, we spoke the mitigation, and then we let the book vote. The book does not always win, but it gets a voice. I went light, keeping only what mattered. Axe, cord, saw, a handful of stakes, the beacon at my chest, the radio whose battery was warm in a way I did not like. The crossing took shape around my breath, each step placed in a niche I had cut, each pause chosen for where the echo sounded almost honest. The white pushed at me from odd angles as if it were testing my borders. Mid-span, the drum under the snow matched the count in my head so neatly that I had to work to set it aside. I said the missing man's name softly, in case the white had made a pocket in which a person could hide from noise. The name came back as the old trouble. Only breath, no bones, just the moisture leaving my mouth and returning as if I had never spoken. I said nothing more and moved. At the far lip I chopped into denser snow and set a new deadman where the layer took a bite with appetite. I packed blocks until the sound under pressure changed to that firm rasp I trust. The rope took a pleasing angle back toward the bench and would give us a good catch if anything misbehaved on the seam. While I worked, the radio spoke with my partner's voice in the tone they use when the weather turns. "Hold your line, we see you, we've got you." The same line walked past my ear with no transit time a heartbeat later. I answered the living version, saying I was tied in, new anchor sound, seam still warm, ready for the first pull if we had to bring weight across. I did not grant the echo any words. On the return step, the white tightened its hands and tried to move the ground by suggestion. I followed my cut niches and found one filled with new drift that felt wrong, a softness that had no business arriving so quickly. I pressed and heard the late answer again, a slack clap, and set the pick for a low self-belay. The snow accepted the steel and then sighed around it, a sound like a tired animal moving over in its stall. I told myself that patience and angle win most fights. They do, until they don't. A thin plate at my left boot cracked and slid, not far, not fast, but with confidence. I let the rope take the hint and sat into the harness. The line sang up valley, and my partner answered by feeding in the exact amount of care a human can give another from a distance. The plate ran out of ideas and held. The white pressed closer to see if I would name it anything but weather. I refused the invitation and climbed the rest of the span with the pettiness that fatigue breeds, one small defiance at a time. Back on the bench, the driver handed me a flask and the steam carried the wrong season into my mask again. Spruce and rain, a creak my memory invents to stay hopeful. I took a swallow that tasted only like metal, and thanks. We spoke the plan that would carry us into the last light we could claim as ours. Retreat to the ridge with the first sled, stage the others behind the new wall I had built, leave the seam to breathe until we returned with more rope and more daylight. Hold our nervous questions for later, when a map and a pencil and warm fingers could interrogate them. The radio placed the same plan back into the air with my voice on it, clean and trimmed of the phrase that makes speech human. I watched my partner not look at me and felt the equal weight of their decision not to ask. We moved. The machine took the lead out, my partner at the leash, me walking the cut niches backward to keep eyes on the seam until it gave us permission to stop looking. The deadman above us creaked in a voice that said Winter had opinions about how long I was allowed to pretend at control. The echo from the cliff shrank as the white thickened and then swelled again without warning, as if the gorge were breathing through different lungs. At the last door before the ridge, the wind shoved with a sudden crude hand, and the toboggan swung. I checked it with the strap, and something in my shoulder complained in a way that would matter later. I kept the complaint. The sled threaded the door, the white rose one more notch, and the ridge resolved out of blankness as a pale promise kept. At the machines, we did what professionals do when the day wants to turn them into story. We made the next safe choice, and the one after that. The driver turned toward the pullout, in a line the corridor would tolerate. My partner took my leash hand for a moment, a quick, quiet pressure that said both thanks and be ready. The radio, eager to belong, gave me my own voice again, saying we were clear, that we were coming off the seam, that we had not found the man. My mouth had not formed those words yet. I formed them anyway, out loud and on purpose, and watched the white curve in toward us like a curtain somebody had finally decided to close. I told myself the ridge was a promise and not a rumor, and the promise had to be kept at a human scale. We staged the first sled for retreat, the driver sealing their hood until only a strip of skin showed the color of cold metal. My partner stood between machine and white, gloves on the belay, eyes never still. The corridor I had cut lay beneath us in shaped blocks and faint ribs, a sentence I hoped a storm could still read. The lower seam breathed its small warm lie and then hid it, as if embarrassed. We named our work again in the shortened language of the field. We would finish clearing the last blind bend, mark a hard stop above the seam, fall back to the pullout, and let daylight and rope argue with whatever the gorge was keeping. It was the plan adults make when the weather is writing its own orders. The white drew closer with slow authority, each breath pulling the world flatter. I moved ahead with the toboggan on a leash and the axe ready to serve as a steadying hand where blocks had drifted soft. My shoulder complained in a quiet, organized way that said I would not be lifting with that arm for a while after today. I gave it a promise of heat and rest later, and let the glove carry what it could. The wind dropped out as if a door had closed somewhere, and the sudden quiet let the under-snow drum step forward, patient and low, a metronome that was not mine. I spoke the driver's name and told them to hold at my mark until the line felt right under their treads. They nodded with the posture of someone saving energy for the exact moment it will matter. At the bend, the corridor thinned to honesty. My blocks stood but looked tired. I pulled the saw and cut two more, quick and square, tamped them until the squeak turned to rasp, then moved to the lip where the seam's little vent had teased the mask all morning. The smell rose again, thicker now, like spruce warmed by a sun that did not exist, like creek stones cupped in hands in a season that was not this one. I set my jaw against it, tapped the surface with the pick, and listened. The echo came back late from the far wall, then early from somewhere below, as if the sound had tried two paths and had not decided which one belonged to stone. I chose the path a driver could survive, and put my body there as punctuation. The radio spoke with bass's even cadence. Report position, report stability, confirm your retreat. Behind that, as near as breath, the same sentence arrived again with out-office noises, precise as a typed line. I answered the living voice and kept my glove off the volume wheel, because there was nothing to be gained by pretending control I did not have. My partner keyed up with a tone I trust and told the driver to advance 3 lengths, then wait at the wall until I gave the next mark. The engine obeyed like a student eager to please. Snow lifted at the track edges and settled without protest, a good sign in a bad hour. I stepped toward the last blind point, a small shoulder that refused to hold a shape, and felt the ground change opinion beneath the crust. The angle wasn't bold, the bridge wasn't thin. Still, the snow under the top layer went slack for a heartbeat, and the leash hummed with a wrong note, the one that means a load has been touched by something outside the ledger. I sat into the harness out of respect, set the pick low and clean, and waited for the give to either decide to become collapse or settle back into pretense. It chose pretense, which can be worse. I asked my partner to bring the belay forward a fraction and felt their answer through the rope, calm and present, the miracle of another human at the end of a thought. The next moments arranged themselves with the kind of clarity field people hate. Everything made a neat kind of sense, just long enough to explain how it would go wrong. The white pulled tight and the wind returned with clumsy force from a new angle, shoving across the corridor instead of along it. The sled nosed into my narrow door and slewed a hair toward the seam. I called for a breath of throttle and a cheat upslope. The driver gave both with skill and humility. The toboggan at my hip yanked as if someone had hooked it from beneath and asked it to attend another meeting. I checked the ring and the strap and found no insult there. The pull came from direction rather than hardware. The dead man above creaked in a polite voice that meant nothing now and everything very soon. Then the edge gave its answer. Not a roar, not a clean fracture. A tired sigh across the apron, a plate unlatching from the shelf with a household sound, gentle and decisive. I leaned back into the harness and set the pick to hold my small part of the world where it belonged. The sled's nose dropped the width of a glove and stopped. The driver froze like a person who has learned the relief of stillness. My partner fed rope with the grace that keeps people from panicking and brought the belay into a low hum that sang inside my ribs. Beneath us, the long drum rolled forward as if the valley itself had taken a step. In the sigh that followed, I had time to choose one cost over another. If I stayed where I was and argued with everything at once, the toboggan would tug me downhill until the line chose for me. If I moved too fast for fear, the driver would correct a small slide with a bigger sin and the sled would find the seam. I chose the cost I could carry. I keyed the mic and told the driver to cut the engine and hold every muscle as if it were a fine thread. I told my partner I would dump the toboggan if it asked a second time, and that I would do it without a vote if the strap went slack and sang again. The replies came in two layers, living and polished, one with breath, one without. I took the one with breath and set the axe deeper. The leash thrummed, not loud, just enough to be honest. I pulled the quick release, felt the strap jump the width of a finger, and watched the toboggan slide away like a decision I did not get to keep. It rode the small moving plate, slewed once with the satisfaction of a problem that has found its true scale, then dropped into the seam and was gone. No drama, no noise, just absence. The pull at my harness eased to something a person can bear. The sled, freed of the tug at its flank, steadied like a mind that has accepted a loss it can name. The driver breathed out for the first time in a long breath and said a word that was not for radios. I logged the cost without ceremony because ceremony would only make it heavier. We stood in a silence that had edges again. The snow, where the plate had been settled into a new shape, and pretended it had always been this way. I tested the remaining bridge with 3 soft taps and got a proper answer twice and a late polite echo once. I told the driver to back along my voice and keep the track edges married to the blocks. They did exactly that, each small correction the product of attention rather than fear. My partner paid out ease and gathered it back like a craftsperson, showing a student where the work lives. Step by careful step, we unspooled ourselves from the bend and returned to a stretch of corridor that liked us. The world did not reward us with a view, only with less white. The wind found its sentence again and blew along the gorge instead of through us. I put my hand to the radio, and it was warm in a way the day did not justify. The beacon at my chest ticked along with forced cheer, as if trying to start a rumor of hope. I pressed its self-test because the body loves rituals. It rewarded me with the same steady pulse it had given all morning. I did not ask it for meanings it could not supply. We reached the ridge by increments, each block a brief decision, and each decision paid for with the kind of attention that leaves your mouth dry. At the machine staging, Base spoke with the grace of people who know their job and their limits, said they would flag the lower route closed at the highway turnout, said we would brief at the pullout and decide whether the weather still allowed rope work or whether the seam would keep its secrets until morning. My partner stood beside me with their hood down just enough that I could see the worry that had been hiding behind fogged lenses. We said the missing man's name in the quiet way you do when the gorge has not returned any proof of life except a track that walks like a plan made by snow. We rode out in low gear, convoy both in the order the corridor wanted, no heroics, just the relief of discipline. Behind us, the white flattened the blocks and pulled our work under its clean erasure. The dead man creaked a last time and joined the sound of full winter. At the pullout, the cabin lights burned the color of warm tools, and for a moment, the storm looked like distance instead of fate. We shut down. We stripped gloves with fingers that had turned to ideas, and we told our story into notebooks and radios in tidy lines that could live inside a report without bringing the gorge's private grammar with them. The driver's hands shook while they poured hot water into a tin, and I looked away so they could own it without having to explain. The cost settled where it always does, in the bend between shoulder and spine, in a tug that would not let me sleep right for a while, in the quiet where a toboggan should have been. I wrote the loss on the equipment sheet and did not dress it up. The missing man's file sat open on the dashboard, with a photo that looked like a person who had a habit of keeping promises until he didn't. We would go back when the white learned some manners, or when we decided to pay more for truth than prudence advised. For now, survival meant saying no to the seam, and yes to the door. Before I climbed into the cab, I lifted the radio to my ear and heard my partner's voice say my name, as if from down the hall. I turned and found them beside me, lips still, eyes on the storm. The device played the sentence we were about to say, polished and calm, trimmed of the phrase that make us human. We'll try again when the light returns. I looked at the river of white and smelled, just for a blink, the wrong season, spruce and rain and stones under a thin sun. Then the door shut, the cab filled with ordinary engine noise, and the gorge kept its own counsel, as if it had a right to. We drove, the corridor a memory under the snow, the valley's low drum settling back into the body like a fact you accept without understanding. The day had let us leave. It had taken its price.